Hey guys, just wanted to get a look at our first packet here that normally I would read out loud to you uh, in class, but I wanted to kind of record a video here that would basically do the same thing. If you want to just read it on your own and do the FBI notes on your own, that's perfectly fine. But I wanted to give the option to actually hear it. Help some kids, other kids probably doesn't matter for them, but just wanted to give you that option. So as we start to learn about a period of time called the Cold War, really we're kind of picking up where World War II left off, and that's kind of where this gets going. So I'm going to get right into it, and then give you the opportunity to kind of get going. And if you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me at either my .org or my .net account. Either one will be fine. All right, so let's take a look at this right here. So this one is called The Fifties, the Iron Curtain. So please follow along while I read. Okay, The Fifties, the Iron Curtain, the roots of the Cold War. During World War II, the Soviet Union fought alongside the USA, Britain, France, and the other allies against Nazi Germany. Really, though, other than hating the Nazis, the Soviets had very little in common with their Allied partners. In fact, the alliance started to break down even during the war, though it held together until after the Axis powers were defeated. With the Nazi threat ended in 1945, the struggle between communist and non-communist nations became the dominant conflict in the world. This struggle became known as the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for domination all over the world. The US tried to spread democracy, while the Soviets encouraged communist nations that would establish governments friendly to them. The competition might occasionally spread into armed conflict, a hot war, but more often it was a clash of systems and beliefs that ranged from science labs to Olympic sports. And there you see a picture of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin at the Yalta Conference, where they tried to set up what the world would look like after the war was over. Didn't really work out too well. In the waning days of World War II, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, promised to hold free elections in the territories of Eastern Europe that the Red Army overran while fighting the Nazis. After the war, though, the Soviets were committed to not ever being invaded again. To make sure of that, Stalin wanted a ring of countries friendly to the Soviet Union surrounding it. So, through rigged elections and Soviet intimidation, all of the countries of Eastern Europe ended up with communist governments identical to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was extraordinarily secretive and suspicious. So as Soviet domination closed off half of Europe in the late 1940s, Winston Churchill described it as an iron curtain stretching across Europe. By 1948, Eastern Europe had become nothing more than satellites of the Soviet Union, following any order, no matter what. See, got a political cartoon, kind of shows the Iron Curtain idea. President Truman was determined to thwart the Soviets from expanding communism any further. The Truman Doctrine was an American policy of containing communism wherever it threatened democracy. Blocking communism later became known as containment. Knowing that hungry and desperate populations in Europe might be willing to turn to communism if things got bad enough, the USA developed an economic aid plan called the Marshall Plan, which was a huge success. Products manufactured or grown in the United States were shipped to Europe to help feed, clothe, and house war-torn Europe, which helped the continent rebuild after World War II and also sparked the American economy to a period of prosperity. The focus of the Cold War shifted to Germany. After the war, Germany was split into 4 occupation zones. Each of the 4 main allies, the USA, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, controlled a zone. This helped Germany rebuild and change their focus into a peaceful country with no residual influence from the Nazis. By 1948, the Western powers, the USA, Britain, and France, wanted to reunite Germany, but Stalin bitterly opposed the move. The Soviet Union suffered the most during the war from Nazi aggression, so they were the most sensitive to a revived Germany. In June 1948, the Soviets blockaded the city of Berlin, which was also divided and deep inside the Soviet zone. West Berlin was a small island of freedom within the Soviet zone, and Stalin wanted to force the Western Allies to leave the city. A blockade is when an army surrounds the city, not letting anything in or out. The Allies responded with an airlift, dropping food and supplies to keep the population of West Berlin alive. The airlift lasted over a year. The Soviets kept the blockade in place for that long, but were not prepared to risk war by shooting down American planes traveling in and out of Berlin. American air power kept the citizens of Berlin fed and clothed until the Soviets finally called off the blockade in May 1949. The German problem was not solved in the years after the war. Eventually, the British, American, and French zones were combined to make the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. After the war, the U.S. led the establishment of the United Nations, which was hoped to allow countries to talk out their problems before resorting to war. After World War I, the League of Nations was supposed to do this, but the USA was never a member of that organization. So when Nazi Germany and Japan became aggressive in the 1930s, the League lacked the muscle to change their behavior. It was hoped that the United Nations, with the USA as a member, could be more effective after World War II in averting a future world war. In 1949, a new alliance was formed to oppose Soviet expansion called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. In response, the Soviets created their own alliance of communist nations called the Warsaw Pact. Only a few years after a devastating world war, the world had drawn lines that seemed to preview another. The risk of that war being world-ending increased in 1949 when the Soviets exploded their own atomic bomb. China, the most populous nation in the world, also had a revolution and fell under the control of the communists. A time of prosperity. After World War II, many veterans returned home to the USA, looking to restart their lives as soon as possible after years away at war. To help, the government passed the GI Bill, which gave millions of them the chance to go to college free of charge. President Truman saw the nation through the early post-war years, which included the fall of Eastern Europe to communism, post-war inflation, and civil rights unrest. As a result, he was deeply unpopular with some of the population. However, others felt Truman made difficult decisions that were unpopular in the short term, but proved to be correct later. In 1948, he won re-election over Republican Thomas Dewey when few people thought he would. The photo of Truman holding up the Chicago Tribune that mistakenly predicted his defeat became the most enduring image of it. Truman hoped to pass programs for education funding, national health insurance, and proposals to reduce racial discrimination, but the Congress failed to pass most of his initiatives. There's that famous photo of the Chicago Tribune predicting that Dewey would defeat Truman. Didn't happen that way. In 1952, former World War II General Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president. Eisenhower, a war hero, was hugely popular among most Americans during his 2 terms as president. By and large, the Eisenhower years were prosperous ones for many Americans. Inflation slowed and unemployment soared. With so many new jobs available, wages increased, putting more money into workers' pockets. Americans responded by spending money on homes, furniture, and cars to an extent not seen since the 1920s. These consumer goods increase the U.S. standard of living, which is a measure of how comfortable life is for a person, group, or country. By the end of the decade, 6 out of 10 American families owned homes and 3 out of 4 owned cars. And there's a picture of Dwight Eisenhower. Not wanting to waste any more time, men coming home from the war got married and began having families almost immediately. The post-war rise in birth rate became known as the baby boom, which lasted from 1946 to 1965. The baby boom increased the demand for food, housing, and consumer goods. As these new families developed, they sought to escape the cities in rural America. A migration to newly developed suburbs began. During the 1950s, the number of people living in the suburbs increased 50%. The crawl continues even to the present day, where formerly rural communities such as Naperville, Yorkville, and even Plano are now considered part of the Chicago metropolitan area, meaning the city and its surrounding suburbs. 2 new experiences dominated youth culture during the 1950s. The first was the invention of television. TV had actually been around since the late 1930s, but it was not until the mid-1950s that technology was affordable enough for most people to access. By the end of the decade, virtually everyone who wanted a television had one. The second new experience that became popular was a new kind of music called rock and roll. Rock and roll is a blend of African American rhythm and blues and country music. By far the most popular rock and roll singer was Elvis Presley, who shocked parents with his provocative dance moves. Conservative TV executives would only show him from the waist up when he first appeared on television in the mid-50s. As many people moved to the suburbs, cities declined. Those who stayed in the cities were often those too poor to afford to move. As a result, standards of living in the cities fell and crime rose as those who could attempted to find a way to move out. And there we had a picture of the TV show I Love Lucy. That's Desi Arnaz. That's his wife, Lucille Ball. She was really kind of the star of that TV show. There's a picture of Elvis Presley. And then here at the bottom, got a picture of Chuck Berry, original rock and roll star, as well as Little Richard, both of them outstanding in their own right. We talk mostly about Elvis, but Chuck and Little Richard definitely deserve their props. All right, so that's it for the reading, and we'll move on to the FBI notes.